But around these sort of sprint events, there's also a bunch of generally accepted Scrum practices. And that you'll see later that user stories are generally accepted Scrum practice. And typically with user stories, you'll do relative estimating to create story points. And then those relative estimating is used for velocity. But these practices aren't necessarily laid out in the Scrum guide. But they're generally accepted, and they find that, that it works well. Like I said, the backlog refinement meeting is not in the Scrum guide, but there's sort of a certain percentage that you should spend each sprint kind of refining the backlog. There's also release planning. There's burn down charts. There's defining ready, which is a little less common. And sometimes there's something called an impediment backlog, which is a list of things that are impediments for your team. And some teams in large organizations will have something called the Scrum of Scrums. These are less common than the backlog refinement meeting and user stories with story points and velocity and burn down charts. Those are really the most common Scrum practices. And the reason that they're Scrum practices is because they find that they work well, they actually enhance the framework. Now, the Scrum Guide itself doesn't say that you have to have user stories, which are little conversations where you describe some bit of customer value. It doesn't necessarily say that those need to be in the product backlog. In fact, it just calls them product backlog items. I mean, you could put anything in the product backlog. It could be a task list, or it could be just an Excel spreadsheet, whatever. The Scrum Guide doesn't lay that out. But user stories have been found to help enhance customer collaboration, and so they're kind of generally accepted Scrum practices. If you work in a large organization, you might have something called the Scrum of Scrums, which is less common, where you have the Scrum teams that get together, where you'll have several Scrum teams that are working on one product, and they'll get together and coordinate so that they can figure out a way to sort of work on large products. And sometimes you even have some of these Scrum of Scrums that have graduated on to some of the larger scaling frameworks. Like I said, the Scaled Agile Framework, which has some of Scrum, and also Large Scale Scrum, which is another framework which kind of builds off of Scrum. So, some of these will actually practices that become a little bit widespread for larger enterprises. But even in these large enterprise implementations, you'll still have these core sort of user stories, backlog refinement meetings, burn down charts. Sometimes you'll have release planning, although it's a little bit difficult when you're working on Scrum products to have release planning meetings. But you'll sometimes use the task board to create sort of release burn down charts, which we'll see later on. So that's kind of not quite in the most common ones, but fairly common. The impediment backlog and the definition of ready are less common, but sometimes you'll see it with your teams. So there's this kind of group of practices that aren't in the Scrum Guide, but over time, last 20 years or so, have been kind of generally accepted Scrum practices. So Scrum makes a big distinction between a defined and empirical process. And so a defined process is something where you know the inputs and you have expected outputs and you have sort of a repeatable process. You can think of a defined process as almost like building a bridge, where you know where you want the bridge to go, you come up with a process, it's repeatable, you sort of plan out exactly where you're going to go, and then you build it out exactly as planned. But software isn't like bridge building. It's much more like science. And so you use an empirical approach. Here you have sort of variable inputs and variable outputs. So you want your process to be adaptable. So think of it this way. Like when I go to different hotels, because I'm traveling to do my Agile training, a lot of times I'll see different showers in different hotel rooms. And so each one of them, I'm always amazed at how different each one of them looks. And so I never really know how to turn on the shower, how to make it sometimes it comes out the bottom, sometimes it comes out the top, sometimes it comes out searing hot, other times it comes out freezing cold. So I can't really have a defined process. I can't really think, okay, when I see a shower, turn both dials, counterclockwise, and then you'll have a comfortable shower. Instead, I have to have a much more empirical process. I have to sort of turn one dial, see what happens, and then react to it. So I'm inspecting and adapting. And then I turn another dial, see what happens, and then react to it. So again, inspecting and adapting. So I don't have a defined process where every time I see a shower, I turn one counterclockwise and I get hot water. Instead, I have an empirical process where I have to turn a little, react, turn a little bit more, react, until I have sort of a comfortable shower. And Scrum is much more, sees software development as much more like an empirical process, where I'm learning things as I'm developing the product, I'm getting new ideas from the customer, and so I need to be able to inspect and adapt. I need to have a process framework that will help me inspect and adapt. Instead, I can't have a traditional sort of top-down project management type framework where all the focus is on having known inputs with expected outputs. Instead, I have to have something that's far more flexible. And that's what the Scrum framework tries to do, is it tries to be much more flexible, to use this empirical approach to develop software. And you'll see that many of the practices with Scrum encourage this kind of empirical process control, this inspecting and adapting. You want to deliver in small chunks. You want to have sort of sprint reviews. You want to get together with the team for daily Scrum. You want to sort of get together and with your customer in the sprint planning meetings. All of it is about getting information, sharing information, inspecting and adapting, and not just focusing on one sort of heavyweight, monolithic process with known inputs and outputs that will get you through it, like building a bridge. So remember that defined approach is much more like bridge building, much more like building cars or manufacturing, and an empirical process is much more like science. And that's what Scrum sees software development as, is much closer to science. So the book that they were referencing is actually written by a professor of chemistry. So it's more like science and less like project management. So you want that empirical approach where you can twist the dials and look at the results and adapt. You don't want this defined approach where you're trying to figure out everything that you want your software product to do and then have an expected outcome. So think about that when you're thinking about Scrum. Remember that all the practices are focused on making sure that you have this empirical approach where you can inspect and adapt.